Good evening, everyone. This is Paul, and in just a couple of days, exactly 5 years since this game came out, I'm going to be reviewing The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Oh, did I forget to mention that this is a really cool bundle? It has a Wii remote that automatically has Wii MotionPlus in it, and a soundtrack that has, the best hits of the 25th anniversary Zelda Symphony, which, man, that was amazing. But I'm not here to talk about the CD or the Wii Remote. I'm here to talk about the game. And is it worth a buy now that it's only 20 bucks if you get it on the Wii U Virtual Console? Well, people's opinions are typically fairly divided on Skyward Sword, though I would say from what I've heard, most of the people are in the at least it was good category. Now, I played this game with my brothers and me taking turns beating the game, and then I eventually decided to beat it myself, but my brothers just hurled every single insult you can imagine at this game. Like, pretty much the whole game was just complaining, complaining, complaining. They even complained about the orchestral nature of the music, saying, well, Zelda just doesn't need a symphony. It doesn't fit in the environment. Ugh. So, now that I've had some time to think it over and actually play it on my own with my sister, who was also watching it, and she loves Skyward Sword, I'm here to try to present the middle ground between the haters and the lover. The game is okay. It's definitely not a bad game. It's definitely not a game that I would avoid, especially not because of that music. Those boss tracks are epic. But merely because the game is so unbalanced. Unbalanced, a bit too long, and too repetitive are my three biggest complaints about it. So first off, in case you haven't played a Zelda game, this is definitely the best place to start. Not only is it chronologically the first in the timeline so far, unless the new game changes that, but Nintendo really tried to break out of the conventional Zelda formula. They didn't do it completely, because you can still technically recognize it as a Zelda game, unlike Breath of the Wild, but they tried. Like, the fields now have a lot more puzzles, and the dungeons feel a bit more open than they did before, and the storyline is especially good for a Zelda game. But first, let's talk about playability. So the big draw with Skyward Sword, let me get this out of the way so I don't distract myself, is that it's the first Zelda game, and at present the only Zelda game, that requires Wii MotionPlus, which, to put that in perspective, the original Wii Remote had an infrared sensor, so it could detect where the Wii Remote was in virtual space. But the Wii MotionPlus attaches to the bottom and adds a gyro sensor, meaning that it can detect even subtle wrist movements, rather than just its positioning in 3D space, allowing for the swordplay to be completely precise. Now, granted, I tried doing some spins and flips like a Jedi, but the game wouldn't read that. But anything that you swipe like this way, you can see it on screen. So unlike that stupid scripted motion waggling in Twilight Princess, you can actually swing your sword and feel good doing it. There are some really cool middle boss fights where the enemies will hold up swords and can block your attacks and counter. And since the enemies can actually see your sword this time around, you can't just be a wagglefest and hope to win. Even some of the earliest enemies in the game already know how to block most of your attacks, so you have to be pretty strategic in how you handle things. The game also is very huge, but not connected, which initially when I heard that the game would be huge, that was a big deal for me. I love big Zelda games. I love Twilight Princess for having such a huge world. But it was also segmented, and that's what kind of ruined it. There's essentially four major areas. There's the sky, which includes Skyloft, which is probably the coolest hub world in the Zelda history, and maybe the only one, but it's essentially the city in the sky that there's this society of knights that believe that the surface, which is basically what's below the clouds, is full of evil monsters, and they have to be in training to be able to fly on top of birds called loftwings and defend the citizens from the under the sky dwellers. We'll call them surface people. And Link, the main protagonist of the Zelda series, happens to be one of those students in training for becoming a knight. However, he has the problem, as he does in most Zelda games, of daydreaming a lot. The phrase head in the clouds has never been more literal than in this game. And Zelda isn't even a princess this time around. She's actually just a normal teenage girl that is really forward. So you can actually tell that Link and Zelda have a thing for each other right off the bat in this game, rather than guessing. And yeah, the Skyloft, other than that opening narrative, is mostly just there for you to do side quests. All the shops are in one building. There's an air shop too, but basically all the shops are right there at Skyloft. You don't have to like search for them while you're in the wilderness, which I kind of liked, but at the same time it is pretty cool to go to just one place when you got some rupees to get rid of. Then there's the three providences, which are opened up every time you get like a pillar of stone to put inside the goddess statue. And even though the places themselves are somewhat cool, like Faron Woods, Elden Volcano, and Lanayru Desert, they're segmented, meaning that you can't get from one to the other without going back into the sky and then dropping down into another one. So the game feels extremely disconnected, and also the scenery starts to get really old really fast. And that's not something you usually say about a Zelda game, because they typically have environments that you love to explore. But typically in a Zelda game, when a person goes back to an environment, it's because of either story purposes or to complete side quests. But with only 3 main providence, the game constantly makes you have to go back to these same 3 areas, maybe getting only a little bit further because you have a new item or a new ability, or something really huge happens, and it changes the entire way you explore. And so there's a lot of tedious backtracking that I think about half of it probably could have been avoided. I feel like a lot of the going back and forth was just put there because Nintendo was determined to make a game as long as most modern day RPGs. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not a bad game. The swordplay works really well, the music is spectacular, and while I personally prefer Twilight Princess's graphics, I do think Nintendo struck a nice medium between Wind Waker's way too cartoony look and Twilight Princess's more realistic but darker look. Skyward Sword is definitely much more like child-oriented, hence why it's E10 and not T like Twilight Princess. But on the other hand, the proportions are more realistic and the graphics overall have more of a believable feel to them. At least Link doesn't have feet this size now. But my rating for how I like the game also is sort of that middle ground between Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. I liked it for trying new things, but not too many new things. That's what Breath of the Wild is for. And flying through the sky on your bird was definitely a lot faster than flying or sailing across the sea, even if the islands were extremely generic and boring, with the exception of Skyloft. Plus, you couldn't really ever do anything cool on the bird. You eventually learn, like, an ability to attack, but you only use that for one instance in the entire game. Then you never need it again. Now, the boss fights were easily among one of the highlights of this game. I say one of, because my actual highlight might surprise you guys. So obviously, with a game like Skyward Sword, you have to use your sword a lot. So not only is your sword used a lot more for puzzles, I won't even bother spoiling them because it's something that couldn't have been done without MotionPlus, but the bosses in particular take a very different turn than what you're used to in a Zelda game. First off, every boss has, or most of the bosses have some kind of dramatic opening that has a story linking to why you're facing the boss, which is kind of cool. And most of the bosses require extensive use of the sword. Now, in previous Zelda games, to put that into perspective, you would search through the dungeon, get an item, and then use that item to defeat the boss. Now, it's more so the fact that the item might be loosely used to help you uncover the boss, and then you'll have to use various sword motions to properly hit. Because don't forget, waggle fests aren't going to work, especially not in the boss fights. You have to know where you're swinging, and the enemies know how to block you. Heck, the very first boss in the game knows how to grab your sword and, like, fling it from your hands, to put that into perspective, if you're not good enough. And that's what makes the game great, because you actually have to think in the battles. You can't just rely on dumb luck or the same old coding. Like, in Twilight Princess, just point your bow up, shoot the guy in the eye, you're good to go. In Skyward Sword, the enemies will have varying, like, attack formations, and you'll have to strike at just the right angle to do it. And even though the music is sometimes a lot more epic than the boss fights, that's okay, because this is the first Zelda game that actually embraces a fully orchestral soundtrack, and quite honestly, I can't think of too many other Zelda games that even come close, with the exception of A Link Between Worlds. However, that also brings its own problems, because there aren't that many bosses. And even though the game seems like it has a lot, most of them are just recycled. Like, I can think of at least 3 bosses in the game that you have to fight at least twice. 2 of those 3 you have to fight 3 times. 1 of those 3 you have to fight twice in the span of an hour. Now, if my brothers weren't complaining before then, they were really complaining after that part. Because they hated the first battle, and they're like, oh boy, now we have to do it again. An hour later, we have to do it again?! And it's widely considered one of the most annoying bosses in Zelda history, to put that into perspective, and I agree. But what about the dungeons and the gameplay? You're probably saying, Paul, this video is going on 11 minutes. You should probably talk more about how the game works outside of the sword. Surprisingly, not too bad. The game has only about 6 items, but that's okay because Nintendo really maximized the usage of what those items were capable of with Wii MotionPlus. I especially love the beetle, being able to twist and turn your Wii remote to make, like, essentially a moving camera that can carry stuff around and hit switches out of reach. It was a cool concept, even if it's not completely original, because Wind Waker had the ability to control a seagull, which essentially did the same thing, just you couldn't really use it in a dungeon. So, the item usage, yeah, it's not really original. Most of them have had some form or another in the Zelda series. They just feel new because of the inclusion of Wii MotionPlus. For instance, bombs. What Zelda game hasn't had bombs? But now you can either do like an overhead shoot, or roll it, and you can even add spin to it if you've played Wii Sports Resort, or even put them away. Like, if you're in the wild and you see a bomb growing from the wild, pick it up and plop it in your bag. So as a result, there are less, like, jars and chests containing bombs than you'd usually see, because they're right out there in the open when you need them. Same thing with the bow. Now, I was kind of concerned that you get the bow super late in the game, but once you do get it, Wii MotionPlus really adds a new layer of realism to being able to aim properly and feeling your aim go wildly out of order, because just like in real archery, you have to have a still hand when you're trying to shoot at a moving target, and if your hand's moving even the slightest, the gyroscope is going to pick up on that. And I was also initially worried about this game that you wouldn't need Z-targeting, because I figured the MotionPlus would do the work for you. Surprisingly, you do, because it helps you focus on the enemies, and even if Z-targeting isn't really useful with the items so much anymore, it does help when you're trying to backflip and dodge from enemies, most of which also carry a sword and shield this time around. And overall, it can just help you to avoid, like, slashing too many enemies that you don't want to focus on, because sometimes they get in packs. Now, I mentioned that there were 3 major things that annoyed me about Skyward Sword. It's repetitious, it feels unnecessarily long, and the final thing was that it was a mixed bag of quality. There are parts of this game that are really amazing. There's a stealth section near the end that's endless amounts of fun. It's just a shame you can't really repeat it after you do it. And then there's a couple of times where you don't have a sword, and you have to avoid any of the enemies you see because they'll kill you in one hit. Those are actually my favorite parts of the whole game. Also, the dungeons didn't blow my mind this time around, but they weren't terrible either. They were just sort of like, they're okay, I guess. There really just wasn't any dungeon that stood out as being particularly creative or inspiring. They just were okay. They were okay, and at least they had good music and nice little entry cinematic so that you could, like, for instance, one dungeon you have to climb up a ladder to enter, the other, like Link's shielding his eyes from the sand that's coming at him when you go into a desert dungeon. So, as far as the difficulty goes, this is definitely one of the harder Zelda games. Nintendo is not ashamed to really crank up the difficulty so that it's almost on par with the top-down Zeldas. However, just in case that's a little bit too overwhelming for you, Nintendo also has their latest practice of also hand-holding you through the difficulty. The Sheikah Stone from Ocarina of Time returns, and the game even has a mandatory cinematic where the Sheikah Stone introduces himself, to put that into perspective. And if that's still not enough help for you, your companion, Fi, who has to be the worst Zelda partner ever because she's so emotionless, can tell you pretty much anything you want to know at any time. And if that's not enough for you, you even have this new method called dousing where you can use your sword like a metal detector and it'll beep when you're getting closer to an object or a person that you're trying to find. So it kind of sort of takes away from the whole exploration aspect that made early Zelda games so much fun. But at least they have options, and at least they're just that, options. You don't have to do them if you don't want to. If you want to figure out the whole game on yourself, go for it. If you don't have the money for a strategy guide, the game's already got one built in. Another thing that I really enjoyed about Skyward Sword was I really liked the upgrading system. Now, previously in Zelda games, you'd get an item and you'd stick with it. But Skyward Sword does a good job of not only making sure that you keep using your items, even the slingshot, after you've already gotten the bow, but you can also upgrade the items so that they're on par with later items. So like your slingshot, you can change it from shooting 1 bullet to 3, or you can, or you can upgrade your beetle so that it can fly faster, stuff like that. Collecting minerals is pretty easy. Usually they're found in like a lot of chests, a lot of pots, and enemies usually drop them. It's kind of annoying that every time you boot up the game, Link holds it up and tells you what you got, even though you've seen it 1,000 times. Same thing with bug catching. The game makes great usage of the Wii MotionPlus to bring back the bug net from A Link to the Past, but then you get reminded of every single bug you catch, and that gets annoying. But at least the upgrading system is easy to use, and it's nowhere near as complicated as games like Xenoblade Chronicles, where I couldn't even figure out what I was doing half the time. So, overall, if you're up for a relatively mixed bag experience with occasionally wishy-washy gameplay that's good 1 minute and terrible the next, I'm looking at you, Lanayru Desert, with all your time-swapping gimmicks. Amazing bosses that are also very repetitive. A surprisingly good story that I won't share with you because it's really deeply poetic and I don't want to spare it. A terrible partner character, but otherwise fairly good character design. Good usage of items. Did I say spectacular music already? I can't say it enough. Spectacular music. Pretty lackluster selection of areas to travel to. What do you think? I could be totally off in my assumptions, but hopefully that's enough for you to be able to make an informed purchase. I would recommend getting it on the Wii U Virtual Console as opposed to getting it on the Wii itself because, it's only $20 if you get it on the Wii U. And I don't think they have too many collector's editions anymore, so you might want to consider that too. So, thank you very much for listening to my review on Skyward Sword. Let me know if there's any other games I can review. Remember that I only review games that I've beaten and are on Nintendo systems. And until the next time, keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless.